Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this fantastic Law Week event on literature and the law, something I've been really looking forward to. I'm Lynn Holtane, I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Law Foundation, and I will introduce you to our very fine panel of speakers in a moment. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, wherever you may be joining us this evening. Tonight, I'm on Bunurong country, and I pay my respects to their elders and to all the generations of First Nations peoples, and especially if we have any on the line this evening, acknowledging that the lands were never ceded. We recognise the impact of colonisation, its legacy of injustice, and the marginalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We believe at the Victoria Law Foundation that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a better and more equitable future. And we're genuinely committed to making a contribution to a better justice system for all of us, especially those vulnerable and most in need. Before we get underway, just a few little housekeeping points to make sure that we all run very smoothly. As attendees, this is a webinar, of course. That means that only the panelists will be seen and heard, but we very much encourage your questions. So please use the Q&A function to either put your own question or to upvote other people's questions that you like the look of, because we will have time for a Q&A at the end. And never fear if you have to bolt off, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll make sure that you get access to the recording after the fact. So please don't concern yourself if you have to go sort of feed the kids or the dog or do any of those household chores that are evident at this time of the evening. I am absolutely delighted to host very briefly this discussion between three people who've all written outstanding books, and in fact all of them have written many outstanding books, and all of them also have a deep understanding of various parts of the law. And that's not an unfamiliar combination. Lawyers who write and writers who have lawyered is not uncommon, but it's something we don't hear explored very often, and certainly not often enough. So this conversation promises some very fascinating insights, and as I've said, I'm really looking forward to it. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists. Nick Gadd is Communications Manager at the VLRC, but more relevantly this evening, he is author of 3 books: the memoir Melbourne Circle, Walking Memory and Loss, and the novels Death of a Typographer and Ghost Lines. Sarah Krasnostein is author of the very best-selling The Trauma Cleaner, which I loved, and also The Believer, and she has a PhD in criminal law. And our third panelist is Jock Serong, aka Jock Serong. Don't let that fool you. He's a former barrister and author of 5 acclaimed novels, including The Burning Island, and on my bedside table right now is Rules of Backyard Cricket. So without further ado, over to you, Nick, and I look forward to catching up with you at the end of your conversation.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. And as you say, there is a long connection between literature and the law. One of my early favourites was John Mortimer, the creator of Rumpole of the Bailey. But a bit earlier than that, Charles Dickens was a law clerk. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was a law school dropout. And so was Harper Lee, the author, of course, of To Kill a Mockingbird, which is perhaps the greatest novel about a trial, unless you include The Trial by Franz Kafka, who was also a law graduate. And a few people have managed to combine successful careers in literature and the law. The English novelist Henry Fielding was not only the author of Tom Jones, but also the Chief Magistrate of London. So on this eminent list, we can include our 2 guests today, Sarah Krasnostein and Jock Serong. So welcome to you both. I think you can probably both unmute yourselves and turn your cameras on now.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Jock. Lovely to have you here.
G'day.
So this session is called Literature and the Law. So my first question is to you both. Jock first. Could you each briefly give an account of your background in the law? Not just what you did, but why did you study law? And did you or do you enjoy working as a lawyer? And how did you transition from the law into literature? Jock?
Oh dear, there's a lot in that. I'll try and do this as compactly as I can. But
Okay.
as a kid, I never had the slightest interest in or knowledge of the law, and I only wanted to be a writer. I fell into a law degree is the best description I can give. I think because I got a year 12 mark that surprised me, and my parents said, oh, you better do a law degree then. And being a good kid, I said, okay, I guess I better. So I did. And that, of course, leads into this sort of bottleneck where everybody's trying to get into articles, and then you get into articles and you hope the firm keeps you, and then they've kept you and you think, okay, what am I doing now? And the career got away from me a little bit, but I practiced very briefly in commercial property in Melbourne, and then I worked in the Western Desert doing native title work with the Mardu people. I worked as a solicitor advocate in Warrnambool for a brief period. Then I was a barrister for about 6 years doing crime in defending in the lower courts and prosecuting in the higher courts, and also doing some asylum seeker work. And then towards the end of my legal career, I was a partner in a firm in Warrnambool and doing all sorts of things. Really, I was a sort of a general litigator. I'm trying to think what else there was in your question, Nick, but I remember...
How did you transition? Yeah, from
that.
Yeah,
I think the key to the transition was that everything I did in the law, I was trying to find the stuff that had stories in it. And to the extent that very often I was distracted from the functional job of being an analytical lawyer by imagery and words and the faces and the voices of the people I was working. You know, you work very intimately with people, particularly as a litigator, I think. And I found myself distracted significantly by the elements of story in all that stuff. And sometimes I can remember sitting in court, and it's this kind of mesmerizing process where voices drone in a big space and it goes for hours and hours and hours, and there's a couple of objects on a bar table in front of you, and your mind is fixated on these story aspects. So I think I knew that my days were numbered. The remarkable thing is it took 17 years for that to happen. So the transition in very brief terms was that I started writing for surfing magazines in my mid-30s, late 30s. And that led into writing little fragments of fiction. And then I got a contract for a novel. And by that stage, I'd been asked to edit a magazine. I had no weekends or annual leave left to do anything but write. And I decided to throw it in and find out what would happen.
What you said about storytelling reminded me of a quote that I came across while I was preparing for this session, which was by an American lawyer / writer whose name I don't recall, but he said, every great lawyer is a great storyteller. And in particular, every great trial lawyer is a great storyteller. What do you think of that, Jock?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of criminal law that is often overlooked, and it's never ever used in drama, is making guilty pleas, because a guilty plea doesn't have the pyrotechnics of cross-examination. But what you do have is this exercise in persuasion where you're saying to the bench, this thing has happened, my client's responsible for this thing, let me see if I can explain how this happened and what needs to happen next. And you are caught within these boundary lines of truth and ethics. And it's an exercise in persuasion and an exercise in finding the detail in a person's life that might raise empathy, or it might give some spark to creativity in sentencing. And to me, that was the best storytelling exercise of all in practicing criminal law. And I think one of the things that really disappointed me about practicing on behalf of asylum seekers was that there was exactly that. There was a story to tell and it could be really compelling. And yet the legal scheme around seeking asylum is so extraordinarily technical that there's no room at all to have that discussion, that you're wandering around inside this enormous act of parliament and it's millions of regulations. And the thing you desperately want to do is say, but look at what this person went through. And there's absolutely no room in the scheme for that to happen.
Well, mention of empathy, let me turn to you, Sarah, because your books are absolutely packed with it. Could I ask you the same question that I just asked Jock? Your background in the law, whether you enjoyed it, and how did you transition into the life of an author?
Well, you could pretty much cut and paste my uni choice from Jock's précis. That's very much my experience as well. Was writing and reading as a child, get these marks in grade 12, and I'm informed that professional writing, which I had wanted to do, was not really an option when one did well. And so I followed my best friend to Melbourne Uni, and she had chosen arts law at Melbourne specifically because I had these green trees. And I thought that arts law was representing artists. I had no idea what that course entailed, or really indeed.
Artists can't afford lawyers to represent them.
Exactly, right. So I ended up doing the law degree and also history. I dropped out of English, the English department pretty early on for a range of reasons. But and then, you know, again, Melbourne Uni, we're not really informed, at least when I went through, which was late 90s, early 2000s, that there are other options apart from the commercial. So I went to the States and I did the New York bar exam, and I was a first-year associate at a firm called Sullivan and Cromwell on Wall Street, and thoroughly did not enjoy myself. You know, I mean, it wasn't just the pace or the work culture. It was more the lack of kind of any edifying education, because you were kind of just cannon fodder on these big litigation deals. And, you know, that wasn't why I had, you know, anything that had nothing to do with the subjects that I had studied to get the marks that got me in there. So I found myself in a very alienating corporate law environment. Came back to Melbourne. I was at Mallison's to do my articles for a full week before I realized that was pretty much the same as the Sullivan experience, and there was probably not much for me there. So I did a few years in legal policy at the Federal Attorney General's Department first, and then at the Department of Justice, as it was then, in Victoria. And I really loved that because I was you know, I think Jock said he was dealing quite intimately with people. I was dealing intimately with paper. So we were in a very small, very nerdy unit located within criminal law, which was reforming the criminal legislation. So we did the criminal procedure bill. I had to go at writing the investigation powers bill, rewrites of substantive offenses. And again, it's kind of informed by all those story elements that Jock pointed out, causation and character and context. And, you know, we're there because we have this love of story and the relationships at its heart. And yet kind of the law keeps you at a necessary remove and kind of bounded within certain conventions of knowing and proving truth. So that got a little old in terms of what I was learning in that environment. And I had started my PhD first at Melbourne and then to Monash, where I transferred into Ari Freiberg's supervision. And eventually I ended up doing that full time and writing with Ari full time and researching, doing consulting research for the Sentencing Advisory Council. And my PhD is, you know, it was looking at methodologies for increasing decreasing unjustified disparity between similar offenders. So it was, if you look at it now, and no one will, but it's kind of a journalistic exploration of the story of sentencing, the story of how we came, you know, in the Australian local context to associate kind of justice with highly individualized modes of knowing. And then I had my first child. So I was on mat leave. I returned to kind of finish up the PhD. And in that same month, I sold the book for what would become the Trauma Cleaner. So I had to kind of decide between these things. And I spent a few years doing both, but the writing became something that I could do full time. And given that that was very much in my heart, I had made that transition. But I do miss that form of kind of legal research and academia a little bit. But I keep it alive a little bit in the stories I tell.
Sure. So that was in fact going to be my follow-up question, so which I'll come back to you with. Do you think that the legal training, from what you've said, it sounds like the answer is certainly yes. Do you think the legal training has been valuable in the more creative nonfiction kind of work that you've done and are doing?
Yeah, I mean, having kind of a forensic mode of analysis readily, or by this point intuitively available, is always, a good thing when you're doing factual writing and journalism. I think that, towards the end of my legal career, I was always being told that my articles were too creative. And then at the start of my creative practice, I was told that those articles were too legal. So, everyone's unhappy. But I think what it gives you is kind of this rich, thick appreciation of context and human action, and kind of practical ways of practical ways of proof and knowing and coming to terms with this undifferentiated pile of information that is the reality of human action most of the time. And I always say that my best writing teacher, and also my only writing teacher, was Ari Freiberg. I mean, what he taught me was a direct mode of writing, not to write defensively, which I think Jock has spoken about previously, the last time we did a law thing together. That poison of wanting to make everyone happy or kind of dance around what you mean. And so he taught me how to do it. And he also, I think, to a large degree, gave me the confidence to do that on the open page, as Learned Hand once said, because there's nowhere to hide there. So you might as well be bold. So yeah, that training gave me a lot.
And what about you, Jock? What are your thoughts on that? What did your legal training give you that you still use when you're writing books about, Sydney in the 1800s?
Yeah, well, I think two things that are poles apart. One is a very simple practical thing, which is that in a day of writing, I think having been a lawyer for so long taught me to use time well, because lawyers, after all, are all about selling time. So I try to map out a day and to use the day in ways that are effective. Even the goofing off is planned and measured. So there's that at the practical level. At a more intangible level, there is the proximity to trauma that it represented for me. So I remember coming out of a very, very sheltered upbringing. Legal practice took me into really horrendous situations quite frequently, and without any mediation or softening or warning or anything. And practicing crime shocks you over and over again. And I think that has found its way into writing the parts of my writing that need shock, that need trauma or need violence, and have helped me to steer clear of being gratuitous, because you see violence in its sort of tawdry context. So that, weirdly enough, has been an insight. And obviously you can't use the very matters that you worked on as a fiction writer, but what you can use is the way those situations felt and the way they sounded. And as I think I said before, a lot of the time you were in a room with one other person, and it was often a pretty awful room. It might have been an interview room in a prison or a conference room in a courthouse or whatever. And you're with one person who has had the worst day of their life, and they're trying to communicate to you what happened and how it felt. And that's extraordinarily powerful. And often a criminal lawyer will spend a year or 2 years or 3 years deconstructing something that happened in 10 minutes years ago. And that deconstructive process can be enormously elaborate, pulling apart every physical and emotional and intellectual element of a 10-minute incident in the middle of the night years ago. As a fiction writer, it's more of a synthesis process. It's synthetic. You're trying to build things rather than take them apart. So I remember coming out of being a lawyer thinking, I don't know that I could ever be a creative or an artistic person, because my mode of operating is dismantling things. And yet you learn to do it, and somehow the two processes mirror each other, which I think is really fascinating.
I'd like to ask you, Jock, then about what happens in your first book, your first novel, Quota, for which won you a Ned Kelly Award. which has as its protagonist a young Melbourne barrister, which I suppose you might have started writing this when you were a Melbourne barrister. You mentioned that you weren't able to use the actual cases that you worked on, which is perhaps a relief, because this book begins with your protagonist, Charlie Jardim, calling the magistrate a heartless old prick and a drunk, for which this barrister does a few days in jail for contempt. He then gets sent off down the coast to track down the key witness in a murder, and then comes back to Melbourne again for the murder trial. And throughout the novel, you've described the technical and the human aspects of this criminal case, and the people having, as you say, the worst day of their lives. You do it with great wit and insight, and I must say, some cynicism. So could you tell us, what was it about the life of a barrister then that inspired you to create, that it wasn't enough for you to be sitting in the rooms with those people, but you thought, okay, I'm going to create this barrister Charlie and send him off on these adventures?
Yeah, I think that the first simple cue, and this cuts across what I said before, but I was once involved in a prosecution where we had an uncooperative witness and in a country town, and we toyed with the idea, because he was the same age as me, we toyed with the idea of sending me to that town to talk to him, not to influence his testimony, but to talk to him about, to reassure him about the process of coming to court and giving evidence. So I guess that was the germ of the idea, was what if this young barrister got sent to a town to talk to a reluctant witness and then got tangled up in everything going on in the town. I guess like almost every novelist, I fell into the trap of being very autobiographical in that first novel. And what's worse, I was pretty poor at disguising it. So we were just chatting before about the fact that the pub in Quota, which is called Dorfin's Woe, and Dorfin's Woe is the name of the rock that the Hesperus hit in the wreck of the Hesperus. So that was the only disguising I did. It is otherwise the pub that is 150 meters from my house right now. And it's a funny old place. But I started doing this shtick when I released the book, where I would say to local people around here, oh, did you recognize yourself in the novel? And they completely freak out. And what's more, they read every single word of the novel. So it has that advantage. But in fact, none of them are in there. What you take are little elements of people and you try to stitch them together into characters of your own. Because oddly enough, taking a real person into your fiction in their entirety never works, because they then don't interlock with the other elements of the novel. So you're trying to create, if you like, facets on the surface of the character that will interlock with the other characters and the situations. And if you take a whole person, that just doesn't work mechanically. So yeah, it was me exploring the feelings of leaving the city and leaving practice as a barrister to live on the coast, and what I was leaving behind in doing that, good things and bad things that I was leaving behind. I hope that I left behind a whole lot of the attitudes you might carry as a barrister in Melbourne, shall I say. And that was surprising in lots of personal ways, and I'm glad of it. But I have an uncle who's a psychotherapist, and when he read the book, he said, oh, this is really easy. Charlie and Patrick are the two halves of your id or your super ego or something. I forget how he put it, but it was all very Jungian. And he told me it was completely obvious what I was doing. But I think when I was writing that novel, it was all happening subconsciously. And that was one of the pleasures of it.
That book, staying with you, Jock, for a moment, that book concludes with a murder trial. And you describe it like this. In all 39 souls in the room, 12 of them female, 39 primates wrapped in fabric, 39 seated apes, talking, listening, maintaining a careful amount of space between each other so as never to touch. That's a great description of a trial, not particularly flattering, I must say. Without giving away the outcome, no spoilers, it could be argued that justice is not entirely done in this trial. In fact, in several of your novels, the weak get exploited, the forces of authority are often as bad as the crims or worse. The bad guys often get away with murder. I wonder, do you think that that's because you were a lawyer, you've seen the system at close range? Are you more aware than most people perhaps of the shortcomings of the law? Does that make its way into the writing?
I remember having been inside the system that it was very, very important to believe all the time that the legal system was the answer to human conflict, that if you didn't have a legal system doing these things, you had anarchy, and that therefore this was the stopping point for all of the conflict in society. I think now that I'm outside of it, I look at that very differently, and I see the legal system as a construct and a part of being a Westminster parliamentary democracy, which in its own terms is a construct and a part of the colonisation of this continent, and that there are other systems of dispute resolution around us all the time. And one of them in particular is an extremely ancient one that belongs to the First Nations peoples. And law, the legal system as we know it, sits within the context of all of those other ways of thinking and resolving problems. And I think I'm interested in the notion that a litigated outcome to conflict might not necessarily be a satisfying one. And that was what the point I was trying to make in Quota, was that people might find their own ways to retribution or to what they see as justice.
Yeah. Turning to you, Sarah, your first book, The Trauma Cleaner, fantastic book, describes the life of Sandra Pankhurst, a transgender woman who works as a trauma cleaner. She goes into houses where there's been a messy death, or houses occupied by hoarders, or people whose houses are full of clutter and mold and rats and feces, and she cleans the houses up with great efficiency while treating the people with great compassion. And in this book, you also write with great compassion. You give us the amazing story of Sandra. You also give us glimpses into the lives of the people whose houses she cleans. So to start with, please, could you tell us, how did you meet Sandra, this amazing person, and what was it that made you think, I must tell her story?
Yeah, so I was at a conference about midway through my thesis, my doctoral thesis, and it was on social services for offenders with acquired brain injuries. And she was in the kind of lobby where we did the breakout sessions, and also there was kind of snacks set up, and she was touting the business, the cleaning business, and she had the card table decorated like this very fancy oasis, and there was a little screen playing before and after scenes of her various trauma cleanups. And the kind of juxtaposition between this wonderfully slick and attractive presentation and this very forceful personality in such a kind of bureaucratically mundane academic environment was startling. And I didn't consciously put on, I didn't even have a writer's hat at that time. I was still writing very much in secret. I wrote regularly, and I've always written regularly, but I hadn't really shown anyone anything. So I wasn't even conscious of the story. I just genuinely wanted to find out more about who this was and this entire profession that I had never heard about. And so I chatted with her, and we met up kind of, I think it was the next week or 2 weeks later, and she shared with me her story. And then I thought, oh, okay, I'll write a profile piece about her. But it became clear in that first meeting that her life and her work kind of had this very integrated aspect, and that the whole thing kind of had the arc of a book. So I thought, I'll have a go at that.
One thing that I loved about the book, and I'm sure all readers did, is that the way you enter into these people's lives, not just Sandra, but the people whose houses she cleans, and you give everybody, there's no judgment, you give everybody the benefit of the doubt. Even at one point, like Sandra's father, who was a very violent guy, you kind of try to understand his motivation as well. And I wonder, where does this come from, this desire of yours to understand people in full? Because I mean, I think it's something that we can all do with more of. Was that anything to do with your background in the law, or is that just a quality, a personality trait that you've always had, and the law had nothing to do with it?
I think it's not really a conscious guiding ethic. But I think if I'm going to devote the years of my life required for a book, and so far it's taken 4 years for each of them, I'm not going to kind of use it as a takedown for those kind of extraordinary, ordinary individuals. That would have its place, strong judgment or mockery or what have you, definitely has a role, but it would be if a newspaper piece or a magazine piece about a public figure. And it really has that distancing effect. And what I'm trying to do is kind of understand that context and motivation and that aspect that, but for whatever you want to call it, there go the rest of us. So I do try to put down anything that functions to create distance so that I can really truly understand. As to the motivation of that, you would probably have to ask my therapist, and he is not talking. But I do think these things are definitely rooted in our childhood experiences, our first families, the social experience of growing up, and our education experience, the ways in which we were heard or not, and creating the world we would like to live in ourselves.
One thing that happens in the book is Sandra, a very powerful moment is where Sandra is describing where you write about the episode in Sandra's life where she's working as a sex worker. She's been raped in a particularly appalling crime, and she succeeds in having the man who raped her charged and convicted. Even though he gets a short sentence, nevertheless, even today, it's difficult to secure a conviction for rape. Trials are still traumatic for victims, as we know, and it was perhaps even harder back then, especially for a transgender sex worker. So you write, Sandra was not only spectacularly courageous, she was remarkably successful. What do you think it was about her that enabled her to be successful, and what does that particular case tell us about the justice system?
Well, the short answer is just the sheer force of her personality, that she had, in certain ways, inevitably taken the messaging of the society around her in terms of what it meant to be transgender if you were born in the 50s in Melbourne. In that case, I think it was 1983. I have to go back and check the book. But and so, yes, we still were dealing with a very blunt justice tool, if we want to talk about what it meant to make a rape complaint in 1983. But she had this wonderful quality of being able to tune out some of that noise and insist on her, basic fundamental human rights. And that was a beautiful example of the force of her character. I wrote, so much of kind of the primary material for that book was missing or it turned up in, unexpected places. But that was, and I think it speaks to her character and that motivation, written out from the original statement that she made to the police. So I had the police report, the copy of it, and I could FOI some of the other additional charge materials. But the statement that was taken right after, it was, I don't remember, about 10 pages, give or take, typed. And so that chapter really was written out from her contemporaneous statement hours after the event. And it was, I think that's where its power lies there, the force of her personality and, how we would want, any of us would want, that kind of justice or redemption to be received after what she had to go through.
Yeah, I mean, it is enormously powerful, that section, and it does, reminds me of what Jock was saying before about people having the worst moment of their lives and you being confronted by that, and it's the power of that just really does come through. Turning back to you, Jock, moving on from Charlie Jardim, your two most recent novels, Preservation and The Burning Island, have actually taken us back in time a couple of centuries. And historical novels set in the Australian colonies of the early 19th century. And they're great books, ripping yarns, I must say, and with fantastic characters and great writing. So congratulations. what fascinates you about this period? Because it wasn't the most obvious step. They were writing novels about 21st century barristers, and now we're back 200 years ago. So what led you down this path?
Mostly it's the fact that I've had a very long connection with those islands. Most of my adult life, I've been going to and from the Furneaux Islands in Bass Strait. And I think I didn't firstly make a conscious decision that I wanted to write historical fiction. Just like when I wrote Quota, I wasn't making a conscious decision to write crime. I'm drawn first of all to what the story is and whether it has grit. And if the grit's there, then you have a look at, okay, where is this thing positioned? And some of the other books I've written and I'm writing now, I literally don't know where they fit. But in this case, it was the fact that there was this remarkably beautiful remote place that's actually very close to civilization. This is an hour's flight from Melbourne, and most people haven't been there. And so there's the physical beauty, there's the remoteness, and then there's this extraordinary history attached to it. Bass Strait was, as most people know, a grassy plain that flooded after successive ice ages, and the Furneaux Islands were a mountain range on the eastern side of that grassy plain, and they became a chain of islands. And nothing much happened there for a very, very long time. And then all of a sudden, in a burst of 50 years between 1797 and 1847, all sorts of extraordinary things happened. And then they kind of went back to sleep again. And I was fascinated by that as a notion. And I started off with the idea that I would write a novel about the 50 years and that I would contain the 50 years within one character's life. And the minute I started writing preservation, I realized that there was just far too much in the 50 years for that to be one book. So it has become 3.
I'd like to ask you about one particular character who appears in both of these books, and that's Lieutenant Joshua Greyling. When you're writing about this era, you're imagining yourself into a society that's pretty lawless. Although there are people who are attempting to impose the rule of law. Nevertheless, in preservation, for example, the characters are survivors of a shipwreck who are trying to make their way back to safety. Among them, there are con men, psychopaths, and scoundrels. They don't all make it back. There's some violent deaths. And there's this one idealistic officer, Lieutenant Joshua Greyling, who wants to bring the murderers to justice. And then we meet him again 30 years later in the next book, The Burning Island, by which time he's lost quite a bit of his idealism. I'd like to ask you about his story arc, if you don't mind, over both the books. He starts out as this kind of very decent guy who's really trying to get to the truth in this lawless society. He ends up, he's a little bit defeated, isn't he? How do you see that?
No, I have a horrible feeling this is autobiography again. I don't know. I think in the first book, he, as you've alluded to, he's conservative, he's idealistic, and he's in a milieu whereby everyone around him is on the make. The Sydney in those early years was an extremely entrepreneurial and corrupt place, and here's this conservative young man who thinks that he can get to the truth if he's patient enough, and he has this wonderful wife who's smarter than he is and off whom he can bounce all of his ideas. The reason I say it might be autobiographical is because in the intervening years between writing the 2 books, I had to age Greyling, but I was aging myself, and I was coming to that point in being the father of daughters. And the minute I say that, I sound like Scott Morrison, being the father of daughters, and my daughters starting to break through the facade that I have any authority at all in this house, and questioning my beliefs and my place, all of our places in the family. And that was very interesting to me. And so in Burning Island, I wanted Greyling to be confronted by his adult daughter, who has devoted so much of her life and her effort and her prospects of matrimony, frankly, to looking after him because of the injuries that really he's done to himself. That to me was an interesting thing to explore. And so I didn't want to have a Greyling who remained above the situation and competent and in control. I wanted him to spin out of control and to look at how his daughter might both love him and be devoted to him, but also be extraordinarily frustrated by him because of all of this self-inflicted pathology in his life.
Yeah, well, he is a really poignant character, I think. And congratulations, by the way, on winning the ARA Historical Novel Prize for that book, The Burning Island, which is very well deserved. And I'm going to come back to you in a little while to ask you about the sealers, but I'm going to cross to you, Sarah, because I'd like to ask you about your second book, The Believer, which is also non-fiction, which introduces us to characters who have a range of beliefs, non-mainstream beliefs, and you could call some of them outsiders, I guess. And they include ghost hunters, creationists, ufologists, a death doula, and members of the Mennonite Church in the Bronx, whom you describe as like the Amish, but not. What was it that drew you to write a book on the subject of belief, and why did you choose these particular believers?
So I don't start off with anything as tidy as that, unfortunately, because the better part of my personality is still quite lawyerly and would like to have a replicable process. I was kind of simultaneously looking at two of those stories, which were very different, and hearing the same phrases being used in those interviews. And that struck me greatly because of the distance between those people and what they, their lives. One was a woman who had been recently released from prison, where she served 35 years for the murder of her husband. And then the other were these Mennonite missionary women, very conservative evangelical Christians. And yet they had many things in common in what they were saying and the stories they were telling themselves. And so with everything that I've written so far, kind of the duration is an aspect of the work I like to see change over time, and it helps me get the requisite depth that I feel I need to be able to render a character accurately. So I stuck with those stories long enough, and I followed them into the places that they led to, and I discovered the other 4 stories in the book. And I really wanted to set myself the challenge of not telling them as a collection, but really braiding them together to maybe make the same sound, or, hit the same note in the song of what turned out to be longing for, the unattainable life, immortal life, or a life free of injustice, or uncertainty, or, death ultimately. So I'm kind of just following a gut feeling. I guess it's the same as with the trauma cleaner, that there's something here, and that it's not just a shorter length piece, but that it's worth sticking with it over time. And then over the years, those meanings kind of reveal itself the deeper you get in the material. But I am still just reeling from Jock saying that everyone knows that the Bass Strait was a grassy plain. That has blown my mind, and it's part of what makes him so good at what he does, that he extends that generosity to the rest of us who are like,
There's a lot in your book, Sarah, that I don't know. I can assure you that.
Well, that's very kind, but yes, the Bass Strait. Whew.
Hey, you didn't talk about Valentich, and he's my favorite bit of the Believers.
Oh, right. That's my, I guess that's my, I kind of hold the Bass Strait close as well, which is why the mind will be susceptible to being blown. But one of the stories is about a pilot called Frederick Valentich, who disappeared in 1978, and we've never found him or his plane, or conclusive evidence about what happened to him. It's the story of that disappearance and of the fiance that he left behind. And, in one respect, it's a whodunit, but it is a story of grief and loss and uncertainty, and how we live out our lives alongside the lives that we could have led. So that all happened, in the Bass Strait, or over the Bass Strait. And whenever I pass it, I kind of just stare out the window, and I just wonder, it has as much of a hold on me as when I first learned about the disappearance. Yeah. Thank you. I think
for me, that goes back to this point about gratuitousness, that the easy path with that story would have been the UFO path. the mystery path. And yet, because of the way you write, you managed to turn that into a study of her memory and her grief. And that was a really beautiful way of treating that story.
Oh, that's very kind. Well, I like to kind of, have some plausible deniability in case I too have an encounter and the ufologists are the only people that will believe me and help me.
Well, I was going to ask you something along those lines, Sarah, which is that although you say at various points in the book that you don't share the beliefs of the people that you're writing about, sometimes it does come through. I sense a certain yearning. There's a certain feeling of, but I wish I did. Is that true? Was I right to be picking that up?
Oh, yes, very much so. Deeply jealous, deeply envious of most of these people. I mean, the stories sit on a spectrum of rationality. And so I think people who read literary nonfiction or attend Law Week events might identify more with certain stories at one end of the spectrum. But ultimately, what they all share in common is this kind of armor of seamless story that had been built around that human vulnerability, which is, how do we deal with the fact that all this ends? And how do we deal with the fundamental injustice of the way things just are sometimes? And so they could have this recourse to a sense-making capacity that made it not all okay, but all going according to a plan. And it was explicable. And there was that kind of certainty, which, I have certain certainties, but nothing as kind of reassuring as that. And it was nice to be next to, even though I didn't share it myself.
Is that what you took from your encounters with Lynn, who's the woman you spoke of, who she was convicted for and sent to prison for more than 30 years for murdering her husband, who was a violent domestic abuser. You write, the worst injustice in the world is the injustice concealed under good order, because all those years she was in prison and having parole refused. Nobody took into account the fact that there'd been a lot of appalling domestic violence. And despite all this, she seems to be a person without bitterness and anger. So is that what you took from your meetings with her?
Yeah. So I've known her for nearly 6 years now, and I would go with her to her church, which was a fairly social justice-y Episcopalian church in Lower Manhattan. And she was very religious, did still believe in a just God, but there was a spaciousness to that story that she told herself, which left her not needing to explain away the crappy parts of life, that those could just sit alongside all of the joys and all of the, enlarging bits of human experience. And she could kind of hold everything in that story. And being next to someone like that is incredibly fortifying. And I learned a great deal from her. Yeah.
Jock, I'd like to come back to you, since we've been talking about groups of outsiders and in the Burning Island, the community. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Burning Island, and I think this again goes to your capacity for fascinating research, is your account of this island community of sealers and their wives who live on these remote islands. And you describe them with sympathy, and your narrator, Eliza, says of them, there was no anarchy out here. There were no laws that bound them. That much was true, but age and inertia were doing a fine job of keeping them civil. I had come to the view that there was no evil to be found out here, even though these people are kind of denigrated by everybody who speaks of them. So talk to us about the sealers, how you researched them, and how did your view of the sealers change in the course of writing the book?
Yeah, it really did. And I'm glad you asked about that, because it was an interesting journey in research. I knew from going to the islands a lot, I knew that there had been sealers and that they occupied the outer islands. There's lots and lots of little outer islands in the Furneaux group around one very big island, which is Flinders. And there's not much fresh water on Flinders, and also not a lot of seals hauled up. So they use the little islands around the outside. And I had understood when I started the projects that the sealers were anarchists, that they were murderers, they were lawless people. what emerged, there's not much written because these are people who didn't want to leave a documentary trace. So a lot of it's inference from other things. The Sydney Gazette had started publishing in, I think, 1803, and they very rapidly set the tone for Sydney media, and they were sensational and full of all sorts of salacious stuff. And they were happy to paint that picture that Bass Strait was full of anarchists and murderers and shipwreckers. And in reality, there were two major waves of sealers. There was a first wave after the wreck of the Sydney Cove caused Bass Strait to be discovered by white people. Aboriginal people obviously had known about it for millennia. But the funny thing about Bass Strait is that it was disappearing on them as well, because the ice age has made it appear and disappear over thousands of years. So it was this appearing, disappearing body of water. The same thing in a much more compressed sense was going on with European settlers, because they had a rough idea there was something there and they had a gap in their charts and they didn't know what was in the gap. So it was a mystery to them as well when they turned up. Anyway, when the wreck of the Sydney Cove caused that mystery to be resolved and we worked out what Bass Strait was, people flooded down there to exploit its resources, and there was this extraordinary slaughter of seals over the first 10 to 15 years, which resulted in the majority of them being driven to local extinction. The industry sort of collapsed for a while after that, and then a decade later, a second wave of sealers came into Bass Strait, and they were very different. They weren't as gung-ho. They were much older men. And in some ways, they lacked physical capacities. And the way they made up for that was by taking Aboriginal wives from all the surrounding coasts. So from Kangaroo Island in South Australia, from Port Fairy, where I am in Western Victoria, from Western Port, from Gippsland, and from lots of different places in mainland Tasmania, these men were taking Aboriginal women. And there is a deep controversy unresolved about what that means. One view says that Aboriginal people, particularly in Tasmania, knew that they were facing a slaughter, and that if their women went and left mainland Tasmania, there was a prospect of families surviving and going on. And that therefore the process was consensual. There is another view that says this was kidnapping and murder and sexual servitude, and it was nothing remotely consensual. And then there's the view that says that the truth is somewhere between the two things. In any event, there were women with the men who were known as Tyree Law, and they did a lot of the physical stuff. They did a lot of the swimming, they handled boats, they could dive for shellfish, they flensed seals, and it freed the men up to do the trading stuff, to do the voyages to other ports. They also shot wallaby on the islands. They harvested and processed mutton birds. So there was this union between Aboriginal women and these sealers that was, whether or not it was just, and that's a significant outstanding question, it was certainly effective. And these men probably led pretty quiet lives, and what the Sydney Gazette would have us believe about them was probably not right. But the shipwreck that kicks off Burning Island was originally put by the Sydney Gazette as a case of deliberate wrecking and the murder of those who survived. In reality, it was probably just one of those mishaps at sea.
And getting to the bottom of that is something that is enormously difficult from this from this range. Yeah. But yes, I mean, good on you for investigating that and writing about that extremely complex and extremely interesting community on those islands. We are getting a bit short on time, but Sarah, I want to come back to you for one quick final question, because you have just published a quarterly essay on mental illness. It's called Not Waving Drowning, and in it you address Australia's mental health system. Now, I know this is a huge topic and we've only got a couple of minutes, so I'm sorry to drop this on you, but people should know that the quarterly essay has just been published and they should rush out and buy it. Why do you think we are getting mental illness so wrong in this country and have done for such a long time? So can you just tell us a little bit, and then people can rush out and buy the quarterly essay?
I'm not great at talking about the writing. I still feel I need 40,000 words to answer that question, but I'll do my best. I look at kind of the fact that there are a few areas as formally examined as mental health in this country. And yet we continue to find ourselves, regardless of where you are in the country, in a state of crisis when it comes to that system. So I kind of look at it through a group psychological lens of perhaps the stigma that all of us have experienced in relation to mental illness in Australia is kind of closely connected to our antecedents as a colonial country, our inability to fully resolve ourselves to the historical reality of the violence involved in that endeavor, and how we have dealt with anything that could be misperceived as weakness or over dependency as a colonial society over the last 200 years. So basically, it's not different to other forms of othering and marginalization that we continue to enable in our public discourse. It can't be separated out. And it's intimately connected to these rituals of historical acknowledgement and proper grieving in order to move on, which I think both of you have written about as well in various ways. That there's a role for storytelling and our historians to kind of tell us what needs to be fixed in order to stop replicating the traumas of the past.
Okay, we are getting very close to time. So I would like to thank you very much, both Sarah and Jock. I urge everybody watching this to rush out and buy their books immediately if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your time. We've covered a lot of ground.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. And thank you so much for your questions, Nick.
Yeah, thanks.
And back to you, Lynn.
Well, that was riveting, and I've got a million questions, but sadly, we are out of time, and unfortunately, I'll have to hold them for another occasion. But I mean, it's certainly not any kind of new thought, but I have to say that for those of us who've had that moment of revelation where the gap between justice and our understanding of justice and fairness and the institution of the law was sort of opened up into a ginormous chasm, the power of your storytelling, all three of you, to try and bridge that gap and to give humanity to the complexities of the experience in and around the law is really vital, I think, to our understanding of the way in which our institutions both support the fine functioning of our society, but also brutalise people in really profound ways, and that is, the complexity around that is really critical for us to understand and to explore in both contemporary and historic contexts for all the reasons that you've described. So thank you to all three of you for your enormous contributions to that effort, especially given that it's so vital for us to hear those Australian voices in this and to understand the Australian context. Because as one of the people who's written a question to us alludes, there is a flood of international fiction and non-fiction that perhaps gives us sort of mixed understandings of the reality of our own systems, and often we're dealing at the other end with people's misconceptions of whether or not we have a Bill of Rights in this country and a constitution that has a 14th Amendment. Because that's what people are exposed to. So the Australian context and your Australian stories are really critical as well, and I think vital to us understanding how we sit today. So thank you all very much indeed to Nick Gadd, Sarah Krasnostein and Jock Serong for your contribution to Law Week 2022. It's been fascinating, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget, if you've had to bolt, or if you've got people that you would love to forward this to, we will send you a link to the recording, and please proliferate as far and wide as you like. And don't forget all the wonderful books that Nick, Sarah and Jock have on offer next time you happen to be in a bookshop. Thanks again, and have a lovely evening. Cheers.